Coming to you live from South Africa.
Ruth, good morning. Welcome to the program. And I would imagine quite an appropriate topic to talk about, very especially in these very dark times of COVID-19, when we hear about all of these unnecessary deaths, because we've not yet got our vaccinations here in South Africa. And we see all around the world just what a terrible toll COVID has taken on the citizens. Now, of course, when I talk about deaths through COVID, we're not minimizing deaths through other causes. I'm just talking about unnecessary deaths. But whether it was a necessary or an unnecessary death, whether your loved one was terminally ill or died in a car accident, a death is a death, a loss is a loss. And I should imagine the grieving process or steps of the grieving process would be similar, or similar steps to be followed in terms of making sense of your loss, trying to pick up the pieces and moving on. Good morning and welcome.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Okay, I've said a mouthful there, so you want to respond to all of that?
No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Talking about the impact that COVID has had and the grief related to those deaths, of course, doesn't minimize any other losses that people have experienced. I think what's happening, though, is that there is a sense of kind of collective grief in related to COVID, both in terms of what people have lost in terms of their daily lives and their finances and opportunities. But I think in terms of the loss of people to an illness that a year and a bit ago no one had any idea about. And I think so it does give, it adds another element in terms of this thing that we're suddenly confronting that has devastated many people's lives and families. And sometimes it's not just been one loss. There have been, a number of members of the same family who have succumbed. So I think that there is a kind of shock about how many people have been affected, and how the grief is not just, it might be even one death can have such a deep impact on dozens and dozens of people.
I must tell you about a personal, my personal feelings around this issue of grief. Very sadly, we as a family lost a very young nephew. He was just a week away from his 33rd birthday, being in hospital for over a month with COVID. An amazing man, Nassim Ahmed Hussein, and he succumbed to COVID. Had his whole life ahead of him. He was a journalist, a scriptwriter, a playwright, etc., etc., etc. And I can't tell you the deep sense of loss that I still feel thinking about him and other people like him. And then on the flip side, just last week, we lost my dear mother-in-law. May she rest in peace. But she was 93 years old. Yes, she's going to be a loss because our history goes with them. But with her passing, I almost feel it's a celebration of her life. She had a peaceful death. She didn't suffer. She just had such a rich, full, beautiful life compared to our nephew. How do we then start supporting people in families with these two different scenarios and try to make sense of the losses and how you support people, how you sympathize with them? What are the kind of things you say? Does it matter? Or are people so locked in their grief that they don't even hear you?
I think that what you're talking about in terms of with some people, especially where they have been older and there's a sense of maybe completion, it is for many people that's easier to resolve and make sense of, because it kind of make sense in the order of things. When we're dealing with the loss of such a young person like your nephew, it's very hard to make sense of, because it just feels like it's the wrong order of things. Someone who's so young with so much left to live, it's very hard to make sense of it. And I think that we have to leave it to people to make their own sense of it. We can't force our beliefs in terms of, why it happened. We don't know. And sometimes what we have to come to terms with is not knowing and not understanding. I think it can be very damaging for you to put your own perspective on things in an attempt to comfort people who are grieving, when you are putting, you come up with your own theory, because that might make sense to you, but it might not make any sense to the person who's grieving. And I think we have to be very careful in our attempts to comfort, where we are imposing our beliefs or the things that make sense to us or make us feel better, because sometimes that can be very hard for people. It's different if they're approaching religious leaders and they're wanting a certain perspective. But if you are trying to support, my sense is the main thing is to express how deeply sorry you are and to ask people what they need. Sometimes they won't know, but I think that sometimes they can't hear you. What's most important, I think, is for people to know that you support them, that you care about them, that you feel very sad about their loss they've had, and for them to know that if there is something that they need that you can do on a practical level, on a companionship level, that they are free to approach you. Everybody grieves differently. Some people want people around them. Other people want to be left alone. So the most important thing is to realize it's important that you, in some way, let the person know that you support them, are thinking of them, and would like to be there for them. But you've got to respect the way that they want you to be there for them. And I would just say yes.
Can you hear me clearly? Because I'm hearing a lot of noise. I'm not sure if it's on my side or your side. Okay, I'm losing you now. Let's take a quick break while Ruth is going to try and sort out all the background noise, I think, on her side of this interview. We'll be back with you in a minute or two.
With Salam Media. This is Salam Media, coming to you live from South Africa.
Kiki's, the taste with a kick. Our revamped exclusive restaurant and takeaway now opened. Kiki strives to serve you and your family with a wide variety of delicious meals. Enjoy our famous chicken, shish, burgers, pasta, pizza, and many more weekly in-store specials. We offer Friday buffet and Bripet with a difference. We cater for corporate functions, velimas, and events. Perja facilities provided. Our exciting competition gourmet menu and new menu to be released at our launch. Visit Kiki's at 235 Matthews Mayiwe Road, Old Stemford Hill Road, Durban. Call 031 209 0119. Kiki's, the taste with a kick.
They say breakfast is the most important meal of the day, yet many children go to school hungry because of poverty. Penny Appeal's Breakfast Club aim to get a warm, hearty meal to underprivileged children so they can spend the day prospering in their schoolwork. Help feed a needy learner by visiting our website on www.pennyappeal.org.za or call 031 1100 573 to find out how you can donate. Penny Appeal. Small change, big difference.
Freedom Stationery supply Marlin and Marlin Kids pens to me and my school friends. They supply just about everything we need to help us get a better education, from books to files to rulers. In fact, any any accessory we need. Freedom Stationery. Education for the nation. What does accessory mean?
Connect and stay ahead with Salam Media. This is Salam Media, coming to you live from South Africa.
Welcome back. We're talking to Ruth Ancer. She is a clinical psychologist based in Johannesburg. We're talking about coping with grief. Now, grieving the death of a person close to you often involves very painful feelings. Waves of grief may come and go over months or even years. And sometimes for some people, it feels like the pain will never end. Ruth is not in studio, but she's with us, Facebook Live, to talk to us about how to cope with loss in your life or loss of a loved one. And I don't think there's a person on earth that hasn't lost a loved one and hasn't been through the grieving process. Ruth, can you hear me? Welcome back.
I can. I hope that the background noise is gone.
Well, you come across very clearly now. Let's get right to the heart of the matter. Let's look at ways to cope with loss. We do know that grieving and the grieving process and the time of your grieving process differs from person to person. How do we kick off? How do we make sense of what we're going through, the pain we're feeling, and please for this pain to be minimized and just go away?
For some people, the pain will remain a lifelong pain, and it is adjusting to a life accommodating that pain. And as you say, everybody is different. Most important thing is that you have to give yourself time. You have to work out what helps in terms of what at times makes the pain more bearable, who helps, and also sometimes there isn't a timetable for grief. There's certainly not a timetable we can impose. And one thing to remember is everyone grieves differently. So there isn't a right way to grieve or a wrong way to grieve. Sometimes it is about finding ways to make that memory of that person meaningful. So some people feel that, they contribute to a cause that was close to the person, or they do something in that person's memory, and they find ways to keep the person alive, but in a different way. And I think it's very important that we are not scared to talk about people who have died. Sometimes people around us might tiptoe because they feel like if they bring up the person's name, they're going to cause you pain, when in fact the pain is there. Bringing up the person's name is telling the person that you remember and that you honor them. So I think we must be careful not to be scared in terms of letting people who are grieving know that we remember. But I think if you are the person grieving, sometimes it's very hard, but we need to find ways of letting people around us know what we need. Sometimes that is just space. Sometimes that is specific kind of support. And just realizing that this is a normal response to something unbearably painful that has happened. So I think being kind to ourselves and not thinking that there's a specific timetable, that after a month or after 6 months or after a year that we shouldn't be tearful. Being tearful is absolutely fine and appropriate. So it's about understanding that your life has changed immeasurably and that you are incredibly sad. So I think it's about being kind to ourselves, but also asking for support and help, but also realizing that this is a pain that we somehow need to learn to live with. The pain, in many ways, we might become used to living with the pain, but when it's a close person, I think we live with the pain. I don't believe pain of you talk about your nephew. In that kind of loss, for close family, the pain doesn't ever disappear. It just becomes part of your life. And initially, it is about realizing that it's a big shock. So there might be times where you feel okay, and then people feel guilty for feeling okay. And that is just a normal shock response where the magnitude of the reality is so enormous that we can't really believe it. So it kind of feels a bit detached for a while. And that's normal. So people suddenly feel guilty because they're not, there might be times when they feel okay and they're laughing about something and then they feel, oh, I should be grieving. It's all part of it. Give yourself space and time, realize it's a process, and also realize that people in the family can all be grieving differently, which can sometimes cause difficulties because some people might feel that a person isn't showing enough grief, or a person is making too much out of it and must get themselves together because it's hard for the children. And I think it's about also respecting that everyone grieves differently. But what is important is that you acknowledge that there is a shared grief, and work out ways that you can manage and feel comfortable. But also, sometimes parents will feel that they cannot grieve in front of children because they don't want the children to feel upset. And I think that while it's important to maintain a level of containment, it is important for children to know that crying and being very sad when something like this has happened is appropriate. Otherwise, you give the message that they must not express any distress, because you're not expressing any distress. And we don't want things to get internalized. And if you are struggling, there are people to reach out to.
Ruth, what about, and when we talk about the grieving process, we're not only talking about people who have passed on, we're talking about you suffer grief, maybe if you've lost your job, your partner, you've gone through a divorce, something's just gone horribly wrong in your life. So there are very many different reasons for grieving, but I should imagine the grieving process is in fact the same. There are different stages you go through. What are those stages? And I also understand they don't necessarily follow a set pattern. Talk to us about that.
I mean, I think the stages became, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross first described 5 stages of grief, and they became a very accessible way of understanding what one can go through. It is important to realize that these aren't necessarily discrete stages. Not everyone goes through the same stages, and that there are many other stages as well. But she talks about some of those stages include, first of all, denial, which is it's very difficult for you to accept the reality of the grief. So that is one stage, and that applies to all kinds of losses as well, where it takes a while for us to kind of, you want to avoid the reality. Other stages, I don't even know if I remember the order of the
anger,
stages.
It's anger.
Yeah, so there's anger, there's acceptance, there's bargaining.
Yes.
And I think the anger is an important one because a lot of times there is a sense of anger, but you don't know, also depending on the circumstances, but sometimes you don't know who to be angry with. So if it's a breakup or a divorce, there it's quite clear. You're going to be angry with the person who you feel has hurt you. But certainly in a case of kind of a death, there isn't someone to be angry with, which means that the anger might be targeted at someone who isn't to blame. So often it's to the doctors or it's to other family members. They should have picked this up earlier, or who was the person who infected the person. So you've got to recognize that anger is part of our absolute feeling of frustration and helplessness. And sometimes if you're around someone who's grieving, you might be the target. And it is a perfectly normal response, but it's very hard when you're on the other side of that. So bargaining is it's a way of trying to, if I do this, then this won't happen. Or, if I do this, then the person might, well, it depends what you're talking about, but it's to try and avoid the sense of hopelessness and helplessness, where you come up with scenarios that might undo what has happened. And those can be often those are quite irrational or quite unrealistic, but it's a way of trying to fight against the reality. And we do move between anger, avoidance, or denial, and then at some point you can get to a stage of acceptance. It doesn't mean you accept and you're happy with it, but it means that you've realized in what way your life has changed, and you find ways of integrating the loss. And when I say moving on, it's not about forgetting, but it's about still living, even though in a different way. And you can go, they're not discrete stages, and you can have a stage where you're feeling a sense of acceptance, and you kind of realize that life is different, and you can take it on, and then you can go straight back into anger or denial. There isn't a discrete, it's not like 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, 4 step, 5 step, I'm there.
Is all of this what you've just shared with us now, allowing yourself to experience the pain of loss? You often hear people saying, experience it, be in the flow of what you're feeling. But there are some people who'd respond and say, but it's too painful, I can't. You also have those people, and we've agreed people are different. You also have those people who just grieve for the rest of their lives. They just are never the same person again. They are literally and figuratively absolutely brokenhearted.
You get those people, and that's what happens sometimes when the grief just feels so unbearable that it is not something that people ever get over. And I think it's really hard for people around them, because we don't want people that we love to suffer, but we also can't wish other people's pain away, or even our own pain away. But it is important that if you find that you are stuck, because grief is a natural response, but sometimes you might feel stuck, and you can't get on with daily tasks which you need to do to survive, if there are other children involved, or if there's responsibilities in terms of work. So when you feel that you are stuck and that you cannot cope after having the time that you need, that is also a time when I would suggest that you go and see a counselor or a therapist who can help you navigate how to still do what needs to be done in terms of living in the world, at the same time as not pushing the grief away. So it's about being able to keep functioning, but have a way to feel unstuck. So I think there is a role. I don't believe everybody who has a loss needs to see a therapist, because, loss is part of life. And for many people, they are able, after a while, to find ways to keep going. But if you can't, we talk about complicated bereavements, where you get stuck and then the grief actually becomes an ongoing depression. And that is where professionals can assist. And also, I think you're right, people are scared of feeling the grief, because it feels like they will never, ever, ever recover from the pain. The problem, if you don't allow yourself to feel the grief, is it will come out in other ways. So many people get sick after there's been a loss. And part of that is because they've internalized so much of the emotional pain, it comes out in their bodies. Their immune system's low. Maybe they're not eating as they should. They're not sleeping as they should. And then they get physically sick. It also can affect social relationships. There can be outbursts of anger. People can get extremely depressed. So it is very frightening to feel the feelings, but it can be more dangerous to keep suppressing them, because at some point they come out. We also have to be careful that people don't turn to maybe drugs or alcohol or other things, which feels like people are trying to alleviate the pain that they don't know how to alleviate.
We also hear therapists talking about give yourself a break from grieving. Question number 1, what's that all about? And then you touched on anger. People who are so deep in their grief, or maybe after they've lost a loved one, things just seem to have been totally railroaded in their lives. They can't seem to get back on track. So they carry this anger around with them and blame the whole world for why things have gone wrong in their lives. that does indicate that there's a serious problem and that person needs to go into some deep therapy, does it not?
Anger becomes the primary way of you responding to the world. That does indicate that you're not managing. And that is often a sign of depression and a sign of feeling helpless. But it can damage the other relationships. So when you're grieving, you've lost somebody, it makes it so much harder if you lose other people in the process because of the way that you are reacting. When someone is having outbursts of grief and being explosive with their temper, that is a sign that they need professional help. I think you mentioned at the beginning when you were just in the part of the same question, is giving yourself, I think, a respite from grief. And I do think that people have to give themselves permission they don't have to always feel that they can never do something that might give them pleasure. I think we often feel like we are not grieving properly.
You actually you feel guilty of possibly indulging in a pleasurable activity or whatever, and then feel guilty and say to yourself, I don't deserve this. That's not normal, is it?
I think it's important to know that sometimes to survive, the burden of grief is so heavy that being able to do things and realize life can go on. It doesn't mean that you are betraying the memory of the person, but actually the person that died, if you had to think about it, it's very unlikely they would want you to be miserable for the rest of your life. And you are miserable anyway. So being able to do things that give you pleasure might be the respite that you need in order to feel the energy to continue grieving. It is important. People often talk about after a major loss, the first time they laugh and how guilty they feel because how can they enjoy anything? It's important that we know that life continues and that we have to be able to, considering you are in such a dark place, that if there is an opportunity to laugh and to smile and to enjoy memories, I think that that's so important as well. Not
okay, we're almost at the end
one
of
that we feel tormented and terrible.
I apologize for the interruption on the line. We've almost come to the end of the program. Just give us more supportive information in case I haven't asked or missed out on one or two relevant questions, very especially a few additional coping skills. And how we as outsiders or family members can spot that this person is going through very deep grief and perhaps they need additional support.
Important to know is that because you're in deep pain doesn't mean you're not coping. It's a response to the loss. Being able to find ways of remembering the person also with joy, sharing pleasant, happy, warm, funny memories of beautiful times shared is so important. To spot someone, if somebody is not okay after a month, that's okay. But if you find that somebody is stuck and is not able to cope, then I think it would be appropriate to suggest that they speak to someone, or for you to go speak to someone and ask, how can I support this person? In terms of giving support, it's asking people what they need and sometimes just being a listening ear. You don't need to give a magic answer. They need to know that they're not alone in their grief and that you care about them and you will be with them.
Ruth Ancer, a clinical psychologist based in Johannesburg. Thank you indeed. I kind of almost feel sad that we've got to be talking about this, but it's very necessary and very relevant because when you lose a loved one, you don't understand your feelings, your emotions. You become confused, you become angry, and you don't know, sometimes just don't know how to grieve. Is that important? Is that important to know how to grieve and how you should go about this?
I think there isn't necessarily a right way. What is important is to be able to feel the feelings you have and know that even though you think you're going mad and crazy, that this is the mad and crazy feelings are part of a normal response to something devastating that has happened. And if you're not sure, to speak to people close to you, but to realize that there isn't a right way to grieve. It's about acknowledging the depth of your pain and knowing that this is appropriate, considering how your life has changed and how much you're going to miss the person.
And on that note, then, to all our loved ones that we've lost from the start of this pandemic, COVID-19, we share your pain. We're sorry that you're in so much of pain. And for people that have died of other causes as well, to you and your loved ones, we feel for you. Thank you, Ruth Ancer. And we hope by way of this program, we've given people some sense of what grieving is all about. Go well and thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.